Introducing Collections is one of Outside In's main strands of programming, which introduces significant art and heritage collections from across the UK as well as internationally. This talk will explore the Crichton Royal Hospital archives. Anne Rinaldi, who's here, who will be speaking today, is a heritage officer with Dumfries and Galloway Council, where she served for 25 years. This Introducing Collections talk will explore the history and evolution of the Crichton Royal Hospital with a focus on its groundbreaking use of creative therapies, and is going to highlight some key artworks and share some of the stories of the artists behind them. So just a quick heads up that this talk will include topics of mental ill health and treatment in a historic context. I'm going to hand over to Anne now to give a more kind of thorough introduction to the topic and explain a little bit about the collection. So Anne, if you're ready, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for the introduction, Charlotte. Just before I begin, as Charlotte's already mentioned, but I just want to highlight in detail that this talk will include topics of the mental health and treatment in a historic context. So most of the talk is based around about 1839 to 1879. I want to acknowledge that the collection uses language that is now not acceptable. I will be describing how the patients were referred to in their casebooks, and these do use outdated language and terminology. The talk does reflect what's recorded in the records, and the records are representative of the approaches, the opinions, and the context in which the records were made. I feel it's very important to reflect the records accurately, whilst acknowledging the challenges in doing this. So just so everybody is on board with that. I steer that. I click my slide. Is that changed on the screen? Because I can't see what you can see. Charlotte can nod. Thank you very much. So this is the first picture. So the Crichton Royal Institution was a pioneering hospital. So it was founded in 1838 by Elizabeth Crichton. This is the original design. A slightly lesser design was built eventually due to costs. So some things don't change. The Crichton served private and charitably funded patients, making its first admission in 1839. And the last patient was transferred in 2008 to a new facility called Mid Park, which was a purpose-built mental health facility, and it's actually just across the road from the Crichton. So patients still use the Crichton grounds to this day. The Crichton gained its royal status in 1840, and it became part of the NHS in 1948. So the record collections are actually owned still by the NHS, but they are looked after by the local authority archive, of which I am archivist. See, is there volume issues? Is that me or is that somebody else? Is it all right for you, Charlotte, my volume? Yeah, that's fine. Just to set some context, so this is the Crichton as it looks now. At present, it's an 85-acre estate, landscaped throughout. There are 147 small businesses on the estate. These include hospitality, entertainment, fitness, there's a farm. There's 3 universities and a college. From the screen, you can see the rural nature of the Crichton estate, and on the bottom left and right are images of Crichton Hall, which was the original hospital building. The estate is expanded over the years, particularly in the early 1900s, with individual buildings being added for patients with specific mental disease, as well as adding a church that you can see in the top left, a theatre building, also in the top left on the left, which is still where Dumfries locals go and see theatre productions. And there's also a golf course, sports field, and the extensive gardens. The Crichton, as we talk about it today, is very much, when we talk about it in this talk, is very much that building on the bottom left and right, Crichton Hall. The rest came later. And there's another building that we'll talk about, which was called the Southern Counties Asylum, but that was knocked down, so I don't have any modern images of that. A little bit of background. So the Crichton was founded in 1838 by a legacy from Dr. James Crichton. Dr. Crichton made his fortune overseas in China and India. He worked for the East India Company as a surgeon, but made his money through private enterprise in India. When he died, he charged his widow Elizabeth and trustees to further the interests of vulnerable people, which he held close to his heart. Elizabeth's first choice was a university. That plan was thwarted by the 5 big Scottish universities of the time. However, now there are universities on the site, which I find quite pleasing. The second plan was for an asylum, which was in keeping with her husband's wishes. He did leave other sums of money to hospitals and other asylums in his will. In 1833, she put towards the trustees' board for the founding and endowing of an asylum in Dumfries. It was delayed slightly due to a lawsuit by her brother-in-law who wanted the cash for himself. But after that, a substantial percentage of the £100,000 that she was left by her husband was spent on establishing the Crichton. For context, and according to Google, this would be around £10 to £14 million in today's terms, so a substantial sum. It was Elizabeth's intention that patients would receive treatments of all kinds for mental health illness and come from all parts of the country, the empire, and from all classes of community, rich and poor. The Crichton was opened with approximately 130 apartments with separate levels for segregation by sex, social status, and illness. In 1839, patients were sought nationally, and there was an advertising campaign for the Crichton Institution. An advert in London said that the Crichton had the means of restoring the insane to reason, or, if that be impossible, to greater tranquillity and happiness than can be secured to them elsewhere. The Saturday magazine described it as surpassing everything of the kind yet established in Europe. And the Crichton, while existing for charitable intention, and it very much did, it maintained the social structures of Victorian Britain. So the Gazette in 1839 described it as being constructed to admit individuals of the most elevated rank in society, enjoying all the comforts, luxuries, privacy which their tastes, habits and station may render agreeable or necessary. We're very much in Victorian Britain here. Here we have the rates of board. It's not the clearest image, but hopefully it gives you an idea. So the highest paying patients had a bathroom, elegant furnishings and a separate dining table with wine and dessert each day and a daily carriage ride. Patients admitted at the lowest rate from the local area did have a private sleeping room, but with an iron bed, and their luxuries included tea for the females and tobacco and beer for industrious males. Clearly there was no industrious females, just the males. 7 years in, Crichton Hall was full, and the building of an additional site called Southern Counties Asylum was introduced, and it opened in 1849 with accommodation for 150, at that time called pauper or charitably funded patients. Squeeze on. So what records do I look after? So the collection we hold dates from 1832 to 2008, and as I said, the NHS own the collection. My Heritage Service is responsible for the storage and access via the Urt Library, which is in Dumfries Town Centre, which is in the bottom left of your screen. The Heritage Service also has much broader archives which complement the Crichtons and set them in the local historic context. Excuse me. There are 110 metres of shelving of Crichton archives, and these are generated by patients, staff and administrators. They include patient records, photographs, artwork, which we'll talk about, maps, plans, ledgers and objects. They provide immense detail, giving unique insight into the care of patients and the running of the institution. The collection is particularly important because it is complete, so it runs all the way through, and they've been kept in immaculate condition throughout the years. There I am, up a ladder in the top left. So what makes the Crichton so unique? The first medical superintendent was Dr. Brown, who's here on the left. And Brown was responsible for the medical and moral ethos set at the Crichton, which we'll talk about a lot. When he left after 19 years, Dr. Gilchrist took over. He was recommended by Brown and had been one of Brown's ardent supporters of the new methods of care. Brown had written a book, What Asylums Were, Are and Ought to Be, which Elizabeth had read, and Elizabeth Hand chose him to open her asylum. He believed in medical and moral treatment. For him, The whole secret of the new system of that moral treatment may be summed up in 2 words: kindness and occupation. His aim was very much recovery, not confinement of the mentally ill. We're going to look and talk about the moral treatments of patients and the creativity, and that's where we'll spend the rest of this talk. And there were truly groundbreaking approaches to patient care. However, I do feel it's important to acknowledge that whilst all of this good work was going on and is evidenced in the records, the Crichton was a Victorian institution and of its time. So Dr. Brown's options for the medical treatment were very much of their day. So they included cathartics to induce sleep, opiates for pain relief, expectorants, mercurials, and various tonics. Traditional treatments were used, such as leeches, cold bathing, purges, and very occasionally restraints. Just to flag that up. We'll now move on to the unique side of the asylum. So the Crichton records tell of the innovative and holistic regime of moral treatment, which was based on creative therapy, so using art, literature, music, and drama. And these are in the records. So innovations included staging the first play performed and produced by asylum patients, Raising the Wind. And I like, which is on the bottom left, is the playbill. And I enjoy that the bottom says, "The curtain and the wind will be raised at 8:30 precisely." So very demanding of when you will attend. Patient-led theatricals continued to be performed from an early period. There are programmes for musical concerts, songs, piano, duets, glee clubs, all performed by patients, but also by staff and staff families, including Mrs. Brown. Patients contributed to dances and soirees, and entertainment was also brought in, such as Punch and Judy shows. Occupation and kindness were completely encouraged, and here's 2 little extracts from the first annual report. And listed on these are that patients took part in visiting exhibitions, which they did. They went into Dumfries Town Centre to exhibitions. They went on picnics, to the theatre, drama, and work-wise they took part in labouring and sewing were the 2 main occupations. The Crichton published the earliest long-lasting magazine written and printed by patients called The New Moon. We have the only complete print run of the earliest magazines. The intention of The New Moon was to give a vehicle for the free and undisguised feelings and views, whether erroneous or not. It was a real outlet for expression within a safe place, and patients developed a lot of agency. In 1853, one writer in the New Moon compared the Crichton to the school for the convalescent. "I have found health in the beautiful gardens, amusements in the theatre, and wisdom in the lecture room, and in each and all of them, kindness and attention." It's very well thought of. Not everything in the New Moon was rosy, so they were honest opinions, and some of them weren't very favourable. Printing was an innovation at the Crichton, so uniquely from 1850, printing was delegated to a patient who happened to be a professional printer, and under this arrangement he was not charged for his board as a voluntary patient. The collection also contains the first library catalogue. As a librarian, I'm very proud. It was made by patients in the asylum, compiled early 1850s, and it's about 50 pages long and details almost 1,500 items. Subsequently, the catalogue was updated annually with listings in the New Moon magazine. The library itself was managed by patients and in operation in Crichton Hall until 1938. There was recognition of reading as a legitimate therapeutic activity, and that's noted in many of the patient casebooks. It's also allowed researchers recently to trace the original images that were copied in many of the patient artworks that we'll look at in a second. So in addition to the music and the theatre and the literature, art was a moral treatment that was used, and that's what we'll spend the rest of our time looking at. So in our collection, there are 134 early artworks and paintings. There's also 38 20th century paintings, but we'll not get that far today. They are all available online, and they've been digitised by the Wellcome Trust, and I'll pop the link up at the end so you can have a look at the whole collection. Most of the Crichton collection is digitised up to 1914. The 134 artworks were uncovered in a cupboard in the Crichton estate in 1983, so fairly recently, in a leather binding entitled Art and Madness. These artworks can be cross-referenced with casebooks, admission registers and annual reports, and they emphasise the impact of creativity on recovery. I must credit writer and historian Maureen Parkes for her research on art and the patients, and highlight her brilliant book called Art and Madness, which has informed much of this talk. So the artwork is part of a distinctive creative therapeutic process at the Crichton, which paved the way for the establishment of art therapy in its modern sense, although Brown would never describe himself as an art therapist. A pamphlet written by Brown suggests that he originally had 3 large volumes of images rather than just one. Brown intended to demonstrate that the artworks produced had real artistic merit. He observed that with only a few exceptions, these melancholy records of art and madness did not reveal a trace or allusion or revelation of the place or circumstance under which the work was taken, or of the mental lesion under which the workman suffered. So there is no known earlier example of asylum art being fostered, collected and valued in such a comprehensive manner, which makes this collection unique. The remarkable feature of these artworks is that as early as 1940, art was therapeutic and not a distraction. Oh, that's changed my screen. Has that changed on your screen either? No? You all right, Charlotte? No, must just be my screen. That's fine, I'll carry on. Patients were taken to view art exhibitions, and the Crichton was the first asylum to introduce art tutors. So patient art was displayed on the walls of the Crichton, as well as alongside well-known artists, and patients were allowed to decorate their own private rooms with artwork. So during Dr. Brown's era, art wasn't encouraged for everybody. From the case books, 46 of Brown's patients are known to have participated, which is less than 4%. 10 were women and 36 were males. Others may well have participated, and it's just not recorded in their case notes. Some of the artworks we have can't be identified or attributed to a specific patient, although some we've kind of worked out through some research. Brown believed that occupation and hobbies which were enjoyed before mental illness could be a gateway to recovery. There's no clear link between the artists in terms of age, geography or illness. There is a link that they came from the educated classes. So Brown was very interested in the level of education of his patients. Brown was keen that charitably funded patients spent their time in occupation that they could then return to once they left, because he was aiming for recovery, not keeping people in the Crichton. So art would not have been a priority to labourers, domestic servants, or the majority of the southern counties' patients. Importantly for us doing research, manuscript notes are found on the reverse of many of the paintings, and they document the lived experiences and condition of the artists. They were likely made by Brown rather than the patients, and this has helped identify whose work they are. He made notes as a reminder of which patient made the work and the state of their mind at the time of the therapy. So I'm going to tell you some more about some of the notes on the artists. Whilst this can be challenging, I think it's important to recognise how the patients were seen and how their art was described and how it aided recovery. So let's start with this one. So if we start with some female patients. So the Crichton very much reflected society, as I've mentioned before, and a lot of women were prepared for domestic life, marriage, child rearing, and spent much of their time doing needlework, sewing and knitting. There are a few identified female artists, of which this is one. So this is Marianne Rigby. So I'll tell you a little bit about each artist that I'm going to feature. So Marianne was admitted in 1846, aged 37. And the description of her in her notes was that she was of haughty disposition and ladylike manners. Her disease was described as distinguished by pride, jealousy and irritability of temper. She was described as unapproachable and morbidly shy. In her admission notes, there's mention that she was anxious for the restoration of her paint box, so she was keen on art before she entered the Crichton. On the reverse of the decorative vignette on the right there is written monomania of pride and suspicion. So monomania, you wouldn't use that today, obviously, meaning partial insanity caused by a single psychological obsession. Flower piece on the left is a fine watercolour with really intricate detail, and it's rather beautiful. Brown described her passionately fond of drawing, and in her notes it said, "Her productions with pencil and in colours are very beautiful and valuable as specimens of art. Their excellence is more wonderful that she labours without the usual applications. The paper placed upon her knee, such constrained position as her bashfulness or irritability may render necessary." She very much got an image of Marianne as a quiet, curled up, patient. This is also hers, a very different style. So Patience often copied from the library books, and the library catalogue has been key to finding out what the original images looked like. So this is her Hotel de Ville. Her notes say that her interest in art declined. However, she did copy images of other asylums, so these two here, which suggest that she continued drawing until at least 53. At 57, her last case note noted that she'd become an expert needlewoman, but Brown regretted her artistic talent had disappeared. So she obviously moved on from being artistic. That's Marianne. This is Margaret Tower. So Margaret was a patient at the Crichton, aged 47. She was an unmarried gentlewoman of Edinburgh, and she'd spent time in 3 other asylums. Many of the patients moved around multiple asylums throughout their care. Although very gentle and good-humoured, she was described as proud and exceedingly sensitive as to the companions with whom she was placed. She was religious and spent time reading the Bible. She did needlework and wrote conundrums for the New Moon magazine, with the answers being printed in the following issue. She did deteriorate and had hallucinations. When she was discharged after 9 years from the Crichton, she moved to an Edinburgh asylum. And this is where she sent this painting, which she sent to Brown, and it's an image of the view from the Crichton. And on the reverse, it says, "To W.A.F. Brown, with best regards and kindest wishes from an obliged friend and admirer." So Brown was obviously very fond of Brown, who'd cared for her for 9 years. Her next image looks very similar to the copied images, but actually it's an original sketch. It's been attributed to Wilhelmina Boden. Her notes are quite harrowing to read and tell of someone in profound crisis. She's described as having acute mania. She did improve though, and she did write for the New Moon, and she did take part in some of the amusements. She was discharged twice and spent time in Glasgow, and then came back to the Crichton. In her early years, she was being both artistic and musical, and in Glasgow she had requested a paint box palette and brushes. This drawing is attributed to her. Brown observes in his notes that she was sketching the scene from her balcony, and this is of the Crichton. And the service building on the right-hand side we know was knocked down in 1857, so the timings fit with Wilhelmina's stay. If it's not her image, then it's definitely another female patient. The reverse side here has 2 images of 2 women. And the women and the men would be separated during their artistic endeavours, so it's most likely she was drawing another woman in her ward. And here we have something different again. So Joanna Hutton. So Joanna was admitted age 62. She was the widow of Reverend James, and we're certain that all her images are her own. She was highly educated, but she'd been ill for 30 years, so she'd been deeply affected by the death of her daughter and suffered hallucinations. She'd been in other asylums before coming to the Crichton. So her case notes state that she copied figures of birds and flowers in brilliant colour, with some considerable ingenuity, and as vain of her success, these avocations, meaning minor hobbies, soften and soothe as well as divert the attention. So she got a lot of benefit out of her colouring. So there are in the collection 7 flowers, all small in size, which may have been drawn from real life rather than books. And the birds, they've identified the copy of the book that she copied the birds from. Joanna also enjoyed theatre, excursions and walking, but she did begin hoarding So Dr. Brown recorded in his annual report that on one occasion she had 5 bags containing over 1,000 items in her skirts, making this perhaps the most extraordinary case of kleptomania on record. She did withdraw from her amusements in the end, and she passed away aged 83. This image, which is kind of hard to see. So this is by Agnes Johnston, who's the only identifiable Southern Counties female patient that we've got artwork for. And it's a sketch of the Crichton Royal itself. And on the reverse, it reads rather movingly, by Agnes Johnston, Inspirations for the Holy Spirit. So hopefully she found the Crichton inspirational. An unmarried housekeeper of retired spirits and moderate education in her mid-50s. She suffered from religious melancholia, modified by delusions, and it's noted that occupation and routine of establishment helped to restore her health on several occasions. So she was admitted and later discharged 4 separate times. So this is a different picture. So Brown was not only interested in the art of his own patients, and some paintings in the collection come from his time after the Crichton. So Brown left the Crichton to become the entitled of the time Commissioner in Lunacy, where he travelled around all different institutions of Scotland, setting standards and being an advisor. So during his travels, he went to Edinburgh, and he kept this picture by Flora Manson. So Flora depicts herself in the picture. She was the wife of a lighthouse keeper, who later was in for a slight aberration, and later developed dementia. But she was pleased and happy, but with many delusions. The other lady is Isabella MacDonald, who was the wife of a plumber and a former domestic servant. So this could be Flora remembering her time together with Isabella. So that's the female patients. There's no clear link between the women, as mentioned before. The themes are very much those thought appropriate for Victorian Britain. So it's flowers, it's landscapes, it's other women. Let's have a look at some of the male pictures. This is unidentified sketch here. Again, there are notes in the records of male patients taking part in art creation that we don't have the artwork for. And some artworks we can't attribute, as mentioned. Appreciation of art by gentlemen was considered to be part of their education. And there's 14 identifiable men in the collection. We've attributed this one to William James Wood. It's an ink sketch. It's quite impressive. This next one is a playbill. So this is by Richard Charteris. He was an officer in the East India Company, and he'd been in Edinburgh asylums 3 times before coming to the Crichton. His sister and aunt also spent time in the Crichton. His Edinburgh notes state that he had no interest in any occupation or amusement. However, by June 1843, a total revolution had taken place. His studies in Oriental characters had been encouraged at the Crichton, and he produced the most beautiful specimens of penmanship ornamented with arabesques and hieroglyphics. So he long and laboriously laboured to produce the perfect playbill for a theatre production, which included language in Hindustani and Persian and English. So the text lists performers and their characters, and Richard eventually also performed in plays. The second image of Richard is an ink drawing, and it has the inscription Mrs. W.A.F. Brown, as well as lots of Oriental script. So Mrs. Brown often led and participated in theatre productions, so there's every chance Richard spent a lot of time with her. He was described by Brown as having achieved triumphs of pictorial art, and when he left, he said the gentleman had been liberated. So he left the Crichton in 46. The different style of painting here, Henry Newling. So Henry was a bookseller from Liverpool, well educated again, and described as of gentle, quiet manners and correct conduct. It's recorded that he was disappointed in trade, which caused him to suffer monomania of pride. He believed himself to be Prince Charles Edward Stuart. In 1844, he was described as still foolish in his notions, but as a person of delicacy and refinement of feeling. He has found much pleasure in reading, drawing in pencil and crayon, and has gained great proficiency in art. So he was discharged and returned 9 years later. It's noted that his cultivation of art, from which so much pleasure and benefit was or appeared to be derived. So he got great benefit out of his artwork. This image, although not signed, does have written on the back, "Pride by Prince Charles Edward." The note's probably written by Brown. The street scene is really accomplished, and it's in a sepia ink with whitening. Hugely detailed and very impressive. Our next artist is George. So George Grieve was a coal miner who was admitted aged 41, and although his case notes do not name the disease he was in for, the reverse of this image has his name and theomania written on it. So theomania being delusions of being God or divine. Whilst his notes from Edinburgh have him being difficult and irritable, at the Crichton he joined the book club and enjoyed society amusements. He studied Hebrew and astronomy and was permitted to give a lecture on astronomy at the Crichton. Grieve created this design of a new asylum. It's not unlike the Crichton in having a central body and then wards off of it, with extensive detail on the back of how it would work. Brown wrote of Grieve's plan for the new asylum as having emulating many of the advantages whilst avoiding the superfluous outlay and defects of those furnished by professional and eminent architects. So Brown clearly thought it was very practical and a good idea. Something different again. So this is one by William Cairns. So William was an unmarried manufacturer from Chorley who had been in the Crichton 8 times. He suffered mania brought on by anxiety about work. So Brown encouraged his drawing and he was given an art teacher. During his 3rd confinement, he was engaged in drawing and in all elegant and studio pursuits. Later on, he's noted as being employed writing for the doctor, and upon his discharge, he was actually employed by Gilchrist as a paid secretary for 6 years, so the connection between staff and patients was strong. This is the only drawing of William's, and it's a local castle. It's not local, it's Inverlochy, a Scottish castle. And on the reverse, it says monomania of powerful vanity. So this is in keeping with his earlier diagnosis. This one is Robert Mayo. So Robert was admitted suffering from melancholia, with incoherence. So he'd spent time in 2 other asylums and had been subject to restraints. So he had a BA, a master's from Oxford, and spent much time reading and studying Hebrew and art at the Crichton. He too was provided with an art teacher. So Brown also described that he had drawn from memory many pictures of a tour he took around Switzerland. From 1852, many of his drawings were retouched rather than new fresh drawings, and these images, this one and the next one, are layered as if they were sort of touched up rather than done from fresh. On the back, he wrote poems and verse. This picture is probably most likely taken from a map rather than a drawing. He also drew this one, which was of imagination. So the Parable of Dr. Brown. And interestingly, although the island is imagination, this is actually Brown's residence on the Crichton as you would see it from the upper wards. It's now called Campbell House. So there's reference of him continuing art until he left after 13 years. But again, obviously very fond of Dr. Brown. David Cathcart is slightly different in his images. So David was admitted to the Crichton labouring under furious mania. Extensive case notes exist for him at the Crichton and his previous asylums. David had delusions that he had lived at various periods of the world's history, but he proved popular amongst his fellow patients and was said to be a most gentle and inoffensive in manner. So Brown noted that David depicts his share in the arts and acts of war in pen and ink sketches with a running commentary. According to Brown, although not altogether destitute of merit, the enormous number suggest that the idea that the world must have been for ages nothing more than a bloody battlefield throughout the eras that David believed he spent time in. There are 7 ink and pen sketches. However, from the notes in Brown's case books, it seems that he produced thousands of images during his time at the Crichton. These drawings fit with Brown's note that they were an expression of his aggressions and antagonisms. So his the aggression of war was taken out in his artwork rather than as a person, as he was of gentle manner. So it worked for him. The next person we'll look at is John Fenn Russell. So John was an unmarried clergyman, and his images are often religious. He was described as of good abilities and varied acquirements. He was admitted just months before Brown left, and he suffered mania of suspicion and a fear of a conspiracy to kill him, though thought to be caused, according to Brown, by too close and exciting application to Bible study. So John had been at Cheadle Asylum previously, and there are 12 drawings by him in the collection. They're not all dated, so it's unsure if they were all done at the Crichton or somewhere produced at Cheadle. We move on to Joseph. So Joseph was an unmarried merchant who'd spent time in South America. He was admitted aged 28, and Brown diagnosed him as having monomania of suspicion. Askew's delusions included the belief that his illness was the result of manipulations of a certain hypnotic impostor on his travels. So these are copied from images of books in the library. He did enjoy amusements, although he did spend a year as a self-imposed mute. There are 12 pictures and 4 sketches of his in the collection. His initial works were copies from images in the library, but his later works, of which these are 2, were more decorative and imaginative. In his later years, cricket is said to have become his main preoccupation rather than art. He was Brown's last patient, and he passed away in 1904, but he spent over 50 years in confinement. And our last male patient that we'll look at today is William Bartholomew. So a substantial number of paintings by Bartholomew survive in the Crichton and other collections. He was in Edinburgh Asylum before he came to the Crichton. He'd been a hatter, an engraver, and then a professional artist. He was admitted first of all in 1953, suffering delirium tremens, so alcohol withdrawal symptoms, and he gradually regained equanimity and directed his attention towards reading and drawing. His art is divided into 2, so some are art of the imagination, such as these, and also portraits. So some of his works are sketchy but lucid, some are immaculately detailed, and others are complex compositions, such as this Cake Month. So this includes text in Latin and English, but with no clear sense or order. In contrast, he did also do images such as these, which show great penmanship and control. Within a year, Brown had recognised his considerable artistic talents and dexterity and put them to good use. So up to 16 drawings remain in the collection of his, including portraits of fellow patients. So these are 4 men who we can identify as patients at the Crichton. Portraits here are likely to have been done for pleasure. However, Brown, like his contemporaries, believed that people with specific mental health issues had physical characteristics in common. And Brown uniquely commissioned Bartholomew, a patient, to create a series of 55 portraits of patients. 11 of these survive now. And are held at the University of Edinburgh. They were gifted to Thomas Laycock, who was a friend of Brown's. So the 11 patients can be identified in the Crichton casebooks, and Brown described these images as surpassing the illustrations of mental diseases that have been published. Interestingly, the patients were all from the Southern Counties Asylum, the non-fee-paying Crichton, and they would have been hand-selected by Brown, which is quite unique. So overall, the subjects of the male artwork was more varied than the women's. They seem to make connections and friendships, and there's more portraits within the male collection. Other than Cathcart and Bartholomew, the images do not display particular mental alienation. Art was very much enjoyed by civilised society, and in taking part, the patients were showing self-control and behaving appropriately for their return to society. It's very much how it was viewed. For me, the artwork is unique in being proactively collected. Brown did, however, select the pieces, and they reflect Victorian society. They're not demonstrating the signs of mental illness like other collections of later asylum artwork do. And this very much feels like something he possibly did on purpose. He wanted to show that the drawings were accomplished and of artistic merit. The collection's unusual in that there's portraits of patients done by other patients. And Brown very much believed that the so-called insane had spells of sanity, and therefore that these artworks demonstrate that. And I do wonder if that's why Brown chose these ones in particular rather than any that probably displayed more distress. The artwork is, however, a tangible demonstration of the moral treatment, and for me they're very special indeed. I hope you enjoyed having a look at them today. So thank you very much. If you have any questions.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. It's fascinating to hear like such a wealth of material in the collection and such a range of artistic styles as well. So it's brilliant seeing some of those examples. So thank you so much. I can see there's a few questions in the chat already. So maybe we'll just kind of go through those and then throw the floor open for anybody to ask their own questions as well. So maybe if people want to kind of raise their hands or give me a wave at some point, we can get around everybody. We've got about 15 minutes left, so it should be time for quite a few questions. I see a couple of people have posted in the chat about sharing links to the Art in Madness book. And we can also maybe share a link. I think you mentioned about the Welcome collection, which has the digitized copies. So we can share links to those definitely after the talk. I think Rona had a question quite early on, so we can ask that. Rona, did you want to?
Yeah, I just have two questions actually. Thank you so much for the talk. It was really, really, I mean, people are using the word inspiring. As a disabled person, I sort of balk at that word because I don't particularly feel that people making sense out of their disordered environment in their head or their disordered environment in the world, making sense of that as and using art and creativity as being especially inspiring because I do it myself. But I can see why people who are not particularly creative or artistic could find it inspiring. But I really enjoyed it. And I do have two questions. The first being not especially relevant to the talk that you've just given, but it's just a general question about mental health treatment, because I was reading about somebody who was having electroconvulsive therapy to sort out what was then called manic depression, which now we know as bipolar disorder. And this would have been probably in the 1940s or 50s. And I was just wondering when pharmaceuticals came into play as a treatment for bipolar disorder, sort of approximately what decade did that come into play? Because ECT basically destroyed her brain and she died quite young, which is really sad. But I was just wondering if there were any other alternatives at the time. That's my first question. My second question is, why is it relevant to refer to people as unmarried? Why is their marital status relevant in your talk? And someone suggested in the chat that it could be a code for gay or lesbian. But I'm just wondering, from your point of view, why is it necessary to call people unmarried? Why is that relevant?
Sure. So the first question about electric shock treatment, I do not know the answer to. I'll just be very honest. I know it did happen at the Crichton until reasonably recently. I would need to look that up, so I'm not sure. Maybe somebody else in the call might have more information on that. The reference to unmarried, it was always in the case notes, which is why I brought them up. A few different theories. I suppose it reflects the social standing of the person, and particularly the woman. You tended to find a lot of unmarried women that were in the Crichton were brought in by family members or brothers rather than sort of their parents as such, as you would imagine, sort of the traditional spinster that stayed within the family and looked after the children, or nieces and nephews. Unmarried men, not sure. Potentially. I'm open to all interpretations. I don't know the answer, so I'm not going to put my own spin on it. But again, if people want to chip in the chat, they may have stronger opinions and views.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne and Rona, for the questions as well. Adeline had a question about the Art in Madness book. Adeline, I didn't know if you wanted to read that out or if you're happy for me to do so.
Hiya. Thanks for the talk. I'm really interested in how to kind of access archives, because I found it really difficult on my own, not being in an institutional educational setting, using kind of, my spare time to do a bit of research that's not academic, not in that framework. So things like this are really accessible and helpful. But no, the question was about all of these different types of labels, diagnoses, and language used in the casebooks. I wanted to know if there was, even if it was like a guidebook or part of the book, I'm wondering, is there a glossary or something?
There's not, to be honest. And as I read them, I have to admit, quite a few of them I had to then look up, because they're not terms that we would use nowadays or recognise. So no, there's definitely a study to be done, or some research, or if anybody wants to look at the archives and pull something together, we'd happily have it. But it's not been done, to my knowledge, a glossary. The language changes through time, and I am hoping that at some point we'll have students that will come and study the language changing, and at what points and why those change, because it's certainly the language that used to describe the various different types of illness, that is not changed, it's not done now. So there must be developments. But there's not a specific glossary. I have to say, Google was my friend.
Yeah, the like reclaiming of words and things like that I find interesting. But all right, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the language that is being used in these kind of collections needs to continually change and be updated. So having a kind of editable glossary would be a really fascinating project to pursue. So there's a question from Beverly, which is about asking if there's a drawing on white fabric, or is it a doily? I'm not sure which piece that was referring to, Beverly.
There was one that looked like it was on a, those white cotton mats with a lace edge, or it could have been a doily.
Yeah, it is. That was William Cairn, which was this one. So it's actually paper. They're all on paper. Yeah, it's that one.
Great, thank you.
That one?
Yes, that's right. It looked like lace.
It does look like lace, or a doily. So it's cut out card. So I don't know how they did it, because they wouldn't have laser printers or any of the modern kit, obviously. But no, it's thick card.
Okay, thanks.
It's beautiful. It's a really lovely piece, and it does look like a doily, definitely. So there's a question from Angela as well. I didn't know, Angela, if you wanted to ask that, or if you're happy for me to read that out. It's just saying, did you say that only the patients who had previously engaged in artistic pursuits would be encouraged to continue it while at Crichton? So art therapy wasn't tried as a treatment, in quote marks.
It's a very good point. Yes, thank you for that. So it appears that the only link between the people that took part in art, the majority, are people that would have participated before because they were from the educated classes. And that seems to have been the link. So they did do it before. I think it's seen as therapy in that it was encouraged, provided, collected, admired. and the impact of it was recorded in the case books. So it was therapy in that sense. I do think it's very much founded in Victorian societal structures. And you can't get away from that, sort of even at the balls or the Halloween parties. The lower classes got lesser costumes than the doctors and the nurses, so they kept that structure all the time. So art was very much seen as something that gentlemen would do or gentlewomen would do. So the definition of therapy, I can absolutely agree with Angela, it's not white, it's not encompassing everybody. It's a good point.
There's a really interesting question from Becky Mary as well, which is asking about the view that art was considered as an occupation, something to do or to occupy yourself. And she's asking if it could have been a step to income, perhaps, or was there any kind of tutoring in the technique around art? Because, there were such different styles within the collection. Was there any kind of practical tuition or guidance given?
So the Crichton did hire professional tutors to go in for certain patients, and there's also evidence of patient-to-patient tutoring, both in art and languages. So they taught each other foreign languages if they spoke that, or musical instruments. So there was that as well. I've forgotten my train of thought, but yes.
Great.
What was the question?
So the question was, was there any tutoring? But I guess
tutoring. So there was, yes. And then I think pieces of art were put into the New Moon magazine, and that was sold. But the artworks themselves, they were not sold. They were just collected or put up in the asylum, as far as I know.
And I guess the other part of the question was kind of asking whether it could have been a step to income, perhaps. So I wonder whether that was kind of considered something that people, once they'd left the Crichton, might have carried on and have used as a source of income after leaving.
Potentially. I've never come across anything referring to that. I think most of the people that took part in the art came from classes that they wouldn't be particularly seeking income other than business or to be married off. So I've never come across that, but it is potential.
Great. I'm just having a look through lots of comments saying thank you. Thanks so much for the inspiring talk. Some people who have kind of personal connections to the Crichton as well. And then a little bit of an answer to Rona's question about when lithium was introduced as a medication. In the 19th century, primarily for treating gout, apparently, although its psychiatric applications began in the 1870s when it was used to treat mania. There's a link to a paper as well. It's fantastic that people are so knowledgeable in the group. So there's lots of really interesting resources there, and I'll stay on for a moment towards the end as well if anyone wants to copy some links from the chat or research further. Someone else has just commented saying fascinating insight into the advancement in Victorian society's management of mental illnesses. Interesting. And then some comments on the NHS today as well. I wonder if anyone also wants to share any last thoughts in terms of kind of projects that they've got on that might be related to this, or any sort of the more personal comments, relations to the Crichton Trust, just before we wrap up, if anyone wants to unmute and share those experiences. Otherwise, we've just got a few more comments saying thank you so much.
I don't have a personal link, but I was wondering how people who had no income were funded to be there. You shared a tariff of the charges and the different levels. I may have missed this, but the question about marital status got me thinking about how women, I think you were not allowed to have your own bank account, you weren't allowed to own property in those days. And so how would, say, a woman without an income and without family funding her be supported to stay there, or would she not be able to?
She would be able to. So the Crichton had was its own charity, so it kept it paid for charitable patients. If you didn't have your own income, there's a lot of the private patients were funded. So there's a book, an obligants book, that lists who was paying the fees for every individual patient as well. So very few people paid their own fees. Quite often it would be a family member that would pay. But so the whole ethos of the Crichton for Elizabeth when she set it up was that the 10 to 14 million pounds that she'd been left would be used to support pauper patients, as they were called, or charitably funded patients. So they absolutely would. The Acts came in, I want to say 1872, don't quote me on that. And then local government and boroughs also paid for healthcare at that point.
Thank you.
Fantastic. And I just had a last question, actually. I was wondering whether you have any or have had any previous kind of past public engagement projects in order to kind of share the collection more widely, or whether you ever work with artists to kind of draw out some of those stories that maybe need a little bit more research or a little bit more digging into, and what are your kind of approaches to that, either in the past or upcoming projects?
So in the past, the main project we've done was called Up the Middle Road, which was an oral history project where a colleague of mine, Valentina, interviewed different connected people, so patients and staff at the Crichton, and then put on a play, and there was original music composed based on music from the collection. So that's been done. We have numerous PhD students and masters that are taking part in adding into the collection, which is nice that it keeps it fresh and active. We are currently seeking funding, it's all about the funding, to expand on the stories of the Crichton. So particularly people that I've come across for this talk and other research that we're in, I would like to know the whole person and do research of their entire character. So like the merchants that were in South America, where did they come from? What happened after they left the Crichton? And build a whole picture of the person rather than just the snapshot of their case notes that we have. So that's our next year's plan. We're also looking, there's an arts festival in Dumfries. So we're currently looking at putting on, engaging some artists and some volunteers to do research, and then some artists. So they could be visual artists, they might be music, to then put on something during the arts festival to represent and widen access to the collection. So it's an ongoing process, but we're working on it, and it's very much a passion project for myself and the Crichton Trust. So we'll keep going. If anybody has a secret benefactor that would like to fund projects, then pass them our way. But
Cool, thank you so much. So it's kind of 2 o'clock, so we're going to probably wrap up there. But I think there's a couple of people who might like to get in touch about sort of potential ideas or projects, and who might like to stay in touch with what else you're putting on in the new year, funding dependent. So it would be great if we can kind of put people in touch with you, or if there's a place where we can allow people to sign up to your newsletter. That would be fantastic. So I'll send out those resources after the talk today by email, and hopefully people who live nearby, I think there are a couple in the room who can maybe get more involved. So
nice.
Fantastic.
Look at Diana nodding furiously there. Excellent. Come see me. That's fine. If you want to include my email address in your email, perfectly happy for that to be shared around, and the link to the Wellcome Trust as well, or our website has got links within it.
Yes, I'll send those around. So yeah, all that remains is, I guess, just to say thank you so much for sharing an insight into the collection today. Thanks, Anne. It was fantastic. And thank you everyone for attending as well. Hopefully see you soon. Take care.